She gave him life. He gave her death. On a moonlit night, a boat glided across the Bay of Naples, a gift from a loving son. But beneath its deck, bolts were loosened, timbers rigged to collapse. Agrippina, Rome's most powerful woman, was meant to drown quietly like a forgotten secret. Instead, she swam ashore, wounded, betrayed, and very much alive. Her reward? Assassins at her door. Her final words? "Strike my womb." This is not just the story of a murder. This is the story of how a mother built an emperor and how he destroyed her to survive. Agrippina the Younger was not born to be silent, soft, or sidelined. She was the daughter of Germanicus, the great-grandniece of Augustus, and the sister of the mad emperor Caligula. From birth, Rome whispered her name with both admiration and fear. But Agrippina wasn't interested in survival. She wanted power, and she would walk through blood to get it. She survived the chaos of Caligula's court and returned stronger after exile. She married strategically, aligned with the right, allies, and watched the imperial throne with cold calculation. When her husband died mysteriously, perhaps not by chance, she married her uncle, the Emperor Claudius. It was scandalous, even for Rome, but Agrippina didn't flinch. Her goal was clear. Her son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the boy, the world would come to know as Nero, would wear the purple robe of empire. She had him adopted by Claudius, displacing the emperor's own biological son. Then she had statues erected of herself beside the emperor, a first for a woman. Coins bore her face. Decrees carried her influence. Rome was learning to bow to a mother, not just a Caesar. When Claudius suddenly died, poisoned by mushrooms, perhaps touched by her hand, the boy Nero became emperor at just 16. But this was no coming-of-age tale. This was the beginning of a puppet regime, with Agrippina holding the strings. She gave Rome an emperor. But she wasn't content to rule behind the curtain. She would seize the throne through him and lose everything. At 16, Nero stepped into the role of emperor, a golden boy with poet's lips and a crown far too heavy for his head. Rome cheered as he took the throne, but the real power didn't sit in the Senate or on the Palatine Hill. It sat beside him, cloaked in dignity and calculation. Agrippina, his mother, the true ruler of Rome. She positioned herself at the heart of power, appearing on imperial coins and attending Senate meetings. Unthinkable for a woman. Ambassadors greeted her first. Imperial guards took orders from her lips. Every law Nero signed bore her influence. He may have worn the purple, but she wore the will. In public, she cloaked her control with elegance. In private, she dictated policies, controlled appointments, and steered every decision. Rome knew this was Agrippina's empire, and Nero was merely the instrument. But adolescence is a dangerous thing, especially in a boy raised on flattery and fear. As Nero tasted power, he began to crave more. His tutors, like Seneca, urged moderation, while his allies whispered rebellion. And Nero, once pliable and eager to please, started pushing back. At first, it was subtle, avoiding her company, resisting her advice. Then slowly he began removing her allies, reshuffling court dynamics, and carving space for himself in the shadows of her rule. But Nero's break from his mother wouldn't be born from politics alone. It would be born from desire, because soon he would meet someone who'd teach him how to hate the woman who made him emperor. And that resistance would find fuel, not in philosophy, nor in politics, but in a woman with the power to unravel it all. Poppaea Sabina didn't just walk into Nero's life, she invaded it, like smoke curling into a sealed room. Beautiful, brilliant, and dangerously manipulative, she knew exactly how to wield her charms. And Nero, barely more than a boy with too much power and too little guidance, fell under her spell almost instantly. She was everything Agrippina wasn't. Soft, where Agrippina was sharp, seductive, where Agrippina was commanding. But her beauty was a weapon, and behind every glance was strategy. Poppaea wasn't interested in love, she wanted power. And there was only one obstacle between her and the throne: Nero's mother. Agrippina had always been possessive of her son. Whispers of inappropriate closeness had circled the imperial palace for years. Some ancient historians even implied incestuous overtones. Whether true or not, the bond between them was uncomfortably tight. Agrippina didn't want Nero to marry, and she certainly didn't want him distracted by a woman who might influence him. Poppaea, on the other hand, saw Agrippina for what she was, the spider at the center of Rome's web, and resolved to cut her out. She worked slowly at first, planting doubts in Nero's ear, questioning his independence, mocking his obedience. "Are you a man," she is said to have whispered, "or just your mother's shadow?" The words stuck. Nero, intoxicated by Poppaea's approval, began to see his mother not as his protector, but as his prison. Tensions exploded when Agrippina openly challenged Poppaea's presence at court. She warned Nero, threatened scandal, and demanded obedience, but the more she pushed, the more Nero pulled away. He began to resent her gaze, her control, her very existence. In his mind, Agrippina had become the enemy. Poppaea fueled the fire. She didn't need to scream or scheme in the open. Her genius lay in the quiet war of suggestion. She knew that Nero's ego was growing, and all she had to do was feed it, stroke it, and then turn it against the one woman who dared to keep it in check. What followed was a power shift so complete it rattled the empire. Agrippina's political allies were dismissed. Her guards were reassigned. Her chambers were moved away from the palace. And Poppaea, she rose, gliding into the imperial spotlight, her influence expanding with every sultry glance and whispered command. But Agrippina wasn't a woman who accepted defeat. She had survived Caligula. She had outmaneuvered Claudius. She had orchestrated Nero's rise from nothing, and she would not be cast aside by a courtesan with a pretty face. She pushed back, warning the Senate, rallying her remaining loyalists, even threatening to replace Nero with Britannicus, the dead Claudius's son, whose murder had always lingered as a bloody stain on Nero's reign. Agrippina still had teeth, but Nero, feeling cornered, began to imagine a life without her, a life where he could rule, love, and live without her shadow, swallowing him whole. Nero had to choose, and in choosing Poppaea, he condemned his own mother. But how do you kill a woman who sees every betrayal before it strikes? The moment Nero chose Poppaea over his mother, the empire shifted. Agrippina, once the architect of power, was now seen as a liability, an aging shadow looming over a young emperor trying to claim his throne in full. But removing her would not be simple. Agrippina wasn't merely powerful, she was feared, worshipped, and worst of all, prepared. Every day she lived was a reminder of Nero's debt. And so, in silence and secrecy, he began to plot her death. The first attempt came, in the most traditional form, poison. Agrippina knew this tactic well. She had allegedly used it to hasten the death of her own husband, Emperor Claudius. Now irony returned to her doorstep. Nero arranged for her wine to be laced with a slow-acting toxin, something subtle enough to resemble natural illness. The goblet was presented during a routine dinner, but Agrippina, ever watchful, either tasted the wrongness or noticed a hesitation in the servant's hand. She sipped, paused, and declined to finish the drink. She became ill, but she survived. And more dangerously, she understood. Nero panicked, but where others would recoil from failure, he doubled down. If poison wouldn't work, perhaps architecture would. His engineers devised a second plan, a rigged ceiling designed to collapse during a dinner in one of Nero's coastal villas. Agrippina was invited, flattered, and welcomed like royalty. Everything was arranged to feel casual and warm. But as she entered the hall, she noticed the change. the furniture repositioned, the tension in the air, the too perfect placement of her seat beneath a newly repaired canopy. She declined to sit. Later, that evening, while the guests were distracted, the mechanism failed, crashing down violently onto empty cushions. Another failure, another humiliation. Nero's fury grew dark. Agrippina did not scream. She did not confront. She simply returned to her villa and sent her son a short letter. It did not accuse. It did not beg. It simply reminded him of the empire she had secured for him, of the enemies she had crushed in his name, of the power she still held if ever she chose to use it, and perhaps of the shame he would never outrun if he succeeded. Nero, trapped between guilt and rage, began to unravel. Agrippina's continued presence at court, though quieter, more reserved, felt like a dagger pressed gently to his throat. She rarely spoke publicly, but her silence carried weight. Senators still bowed, her name still inspired fear, and worst of all, Rome still loved her resilience. Poppaea pressed harder now. "As long as she lives," she warned, "you are not. Emperor, only her son." And it was true. Agrippina's mere existence eroded Nero's authority. He was still the boy she raised, the puppet she crowned, the child she controlled. Every decree he made, every law he passed, it all sat beneath her shadow. He needed a new plan, one that wouldn't just kill Agrippina, but kill the image of him as a cowardly son. Something clean, quiet, a tragedy, not a scandal. And so the idea emerged, a boat. If poison had failed, and if brute traps had backfired, perhaps the gods, or at least the sea, could help. A gift, he would call it, a gesture of reconciliation. A splendid pleasure barge outfitted with gold-trimmed sails, polished mahogany, and servants trained to bow low and smile wide. But beneath its elegance, the ship would be designed to murder. The floor of the deck would be rigged to collapse. Heavy lead weights would fall, striking those seated below. If that failed, the entire hull would be built to come apart on command, plunging Agrippina into the sea. Drowning would erase all signs. There would be no blood, no bruises, just a mother lost in a maritime accident. To the public, it would appear as fate, a tragic, unpreventable disaster. Nero rehearsed his grief. He practiced the lines he would deliver before the Senate. He even ordered preliminary sketches for a statue in her honor, so that when the time came, he could honor her death with tears and marble, while wiping away his crime in the tide. But deep inside, he knew Agrippina was not so easily destroyed. Still, the stage was set. The death ship was nearly complete. The invitation would soon be sent, and this time there would be no hesitation, no missed goblet, no empty chair. The sun had tried poison. He had tried deception. Now he would offer the sea itself. So he would lure her onto a boat, a stage for murder floating on black waters, and try to let the sea do what poison could not. The plan was elegant, deceptive, theatrical. If poison had failed, and if the palace walls no longer offered secrecy, Nero would turn to nature, or rather, to illusion. He would gift his mother a boat, a beautiful, luxurious vessel, a symbol of peace, a reconciliation gesture from a loving son, a son who had already decided she must die. The ship was crafted in secret, a death trap built to mimic grace. Its hull was sabotaged, beams were weakened, bolts loosened, a mechanism rigged to collapse a section of the deck at sea. If that didn't work, the entire ship would break apart beneath the waves, sending Agrippina into the depths. No swords, no witnesses, only water, silent and indifferent. It would be the perfect crime, a tragic accident at sea, an imperial mother taken too soon by Neptune himself. When Nero invited Agrippina to join the cruise along the Bay of Naples, she hesitated. She was many things, ruthless, ambitious, calculating, but she wasn't naive. Still, she accepted. Maybe she believed he wouldn't dare try again so soon after the failed poisoning and the tense confrontations. Maybe she believed in some lingering part of her that he still loved her. Or maybe she simply wanted to confront whatever fate Nero was willing to bring. The night was calm. The moon cast a silver ribbon over the sea as Agrippina boarded the vessel, accompanied by a handful of attendants, including her close friend Acironia Polla. The ship, adorned in rich drapery and polished brass, floated like a promise. For a while, all was quiet. The boat drifted peacefully into open water. Then, the trap was sprung. Without warning, part of the deck above collapsed. Heavy lead ballast crashed downward. Acironia was struck and killed instantly. Screams filled the night as the deck caved in and water poured through the hull. The ship groaned as if in agony and began to sink. The death of Agrippina seemed inevitable. But fate, or perhaps divine irony, had other plans. In the chaos, Agrippina wasn't crushed. The structure meant to fall directly upon her somehow missed. She plunged into the cold black water, wounded but alive. And in that moment, she did not panic. She did not scream. She swam amidst the shattered remains of the vessel and the frantic cries of drowning servants. Agrippina clawed her way toward the shore. Her arm bled from a deep gash, but her mind was clear. Survival was instinctive. She pushed past fear, pushed past pain, and focused only on the shorelights flickering in the distance. In the confusion, some of the crew, assuming she had died, reported her dead. Nero, hearing the news, celebrated prematurely. He toasted with Poppaea. Finally, it was over. The ghost of his mother had been cast into the sea, but hours later a message arrived from Antium, one sentence. "Your mother has survived and sends her regards." Nero froze. Agrippina had not only survived, she had made sure he knew it. It was not just a report of life, it was a declaration of war. She knew it all. The fake reconciliation, the booby-trapped ship, the murder disguised as a son's gift, and still she lived. For Nero, this was more than a failed assassination. This was a spiritual disaster. He had attempted to kill his own mother, and not only had she escaped, she had emerged stronger. She had proven yet again that she was invincible, divine, untouchable. Rome began to whisper. Had the gods spared her? Had the sea rejected her death? Was she protected by fate itself? Some even began to call her a living goddess, a woman beyond the reach of blades or treachery. And Nero, he unraveled, his pride shattered, his fear deepened. If she had survived this, what would she survive next? Would she come for him? Would she dethrone him, poison him, expose him? The guilt he tried to bury beneath the waves now rose like a storm. He could not rest. He could not rule. He could not breathe, knowing she was still alive, still watching. And so, the boy emperor did what desperate rulers have always done. He decided that the next attempt would not rely on engineering or accident. The sea had failed him, so now he would call upon men, not waves, but blades. When miracles fail to kill, monsters are sent. Nero would dispatch blades in the night. And this time Rome would drown in silence. The sea had failed to claim her, poison had failed to break her, and Nero's carefully staged murder at sea had collapsed under its own treachery. Agrippina had once again survived, wounded, humiliated, but breathing. She returned to her villa at Antium, not as a mother nor as an empress, but as a warning. Nero was not just angry, he was terrified. When word reached him that Agrippina had swum ashore alive, bleeding and defiant, he reportedly collapsed in fear. This was no longer a political threat. It was something closer to a curse. In Nero's eyes, Agrippina had crossed into the realm of the unnatural. She was no longer just his mother. She was a phantom that would haunt him until she was truly gone. Poppaea Sabina, his lover and soon-to-be empress, poured oil on the fire. She reminded Nero that as long as Agrippina lived, his legitimacy would be questioned. She whispered that Rome might still turn to Agrippina's bloodline, perhaps even to Britannicus had he lived, or another branch of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. She implied that Agrippina could raise rebellion from her villa with a single word. The court echoed the same sentiment. Agrippina would never stop. She would never forgive. She would never surrender. If Nero wanted to rule, truly rule, he had one option left, and so the final order was given. Under cover of night, a group of assassins was dispatched. Leading them was Anicetus, the naval officer who had once been a trusted friend of Agrippina, and now her executioner. He had helped design the death ship. Its failure had shamed him. This task would redeem him or destroy him. They set sail quietly across the Bay of Naples, mooring near the villa with minimal noise. Guards loyal to Agrippina had been quietly dismissed in the days prior. Some were bribed, others were threatened. The path to her chamber was unguarded. Agrippina was resting. Her shoulder still bore the wound from the shipwreck, a deep gash where the beams had fallen. Servants had been tending to her, but even they were on edge. Everyone felt it. The storm was not over. It had only paused. She heard them before. She saw them. Footsteps in the courtyard, the creak of sandals on marble, the unmistakable silence of armed men moving with purpose. When they entered her chamber, torchlight casting monstrous shadows across the walls, Agrippina did not scream. She did not cry. She stood, slowly, painfully, and looked each of them in the eye. She knew why they were there. Some say she tried to speak, others say she simply nodded. But one detail survives in every account, passed down through generations, of horrified historians and stunned poets alike. She bared her chest, and with a voice that shook the air, she said, "Strike here, strike the womb that bore him." Not a plea, not desperation, a command. The assassins hesitated, one even stepped back. But Anicetus moved forward. Steel flashed. She was stabbed. Once, then again, then again. The room filled with the sickening sound of betrayal made flesh. Blood spread across the floor like spilled ink, and with it, the last breath of Rome's most dangerous woman left her lips. Agrippina was dead. The assassins fled back into the night, their torches flickering across the bay like ghosts. Nero waited for confirmation. When it came, he reportedly froze, then trembled, then laughed with relief. But the laughter was short-lived. Almost immediately, the weight of the act began to settle. He had done what no emperor before him had dared. He had committed matricide, the unthinkable crime, the one even the gods abhorred. He tried to control the narrative. He claimed Agrippina had plotted against him, that she had forced his hand. He claimed she died by her own will, by her own blade. He sent out statements to the Senate, carefully worded lies stitched together with fear. He buried her quickly, without honors, without a procession, without even a name carved on a stone. But Rome was not blind. The people did not forget her ambition, her strength, or her iron will. And they would not forget the way she died. Neither would Nero, because that final moment, the blood, the defiance, the words, "Strike my womb," would not fade. Not from history, not from memory, not from the boy she had created, crowned and destroyed. But Nero's victory was no relief. The funeral was rushed. The whispers began, and no fire could burn the guilt now rising like smoke. Agrippina the Younger, daughter of Germanicus, Empress of Rome, mother of the emperor, died not with a triumph, but with a dagger. Her funeral, if it can be called that, was a quiet disgrace. The day after her assassination, Nero sent out word that Agrippina had died suddenly of natural causes. A clumsy lie, even by Roman standards. The truth, of course, had already begun to circulate in whispers through the streets and palaces of the capital. Rome had always been a city of secrets, but some secrets are too loud to keep. There was no public mourning, no official procession, no golden urn carried through the forum, no eulogies, no senators draping their togas in black. There was only ash, Agrippina's body, according to accounts, was hastily cremated on the grounds of her villa at Antium. No priest consecrated the fire. No monument was raised. Her remains were entombed in an unmarked grave, as if the empire hoped it could bury her memory alongside her bones. For a woman who had stood beside emperors, who had ruled through them, who had carved a path through exile, scandal, and conspiracy, it was a humiliating end. But perhaps not unexpected. Nero had not only killed her, he wanted to erase her. And that erasure began the moment the smoke from her pyre faded into the sky. He ordered her name removed from all public records. Her statues were torn down, portraits burned. Her coinage was melted, her image wiped from marble, as if Rome had collectively decided she never existed. But the more Nero tried to silence her memory, the louder it became. Because the people remembered. They remembered the woman who had once stood beside Claudius in the Forum. They remembered her sharp mind, her command of the court, her calculated rise. They remembered that Agrippina, for all her ambition and ruthlessness, had brought stability during one of the most volatile transitions in Roman history. And now she was gone, not vanished by old age or illness, but assassinated in the night by her own son. Rumors flew like arrows. Some said she had plotted to kill Nero first. Others said she had tried to flee the empire. A few even believed Nero's original cover story, that Agrippina had taken her own life out of shame. But most did not. Because Rome knew Agrippina. She was not a woman who surrendered. The senators, once cowed by her presence, now murmured behind closed doors. The public, who had feared her, now questioned her absence. Nero's claim to legitimacy had always rested on Agrippina, on her bloodline, her cunning, her manipulation of the imperial machine. Now that foundation was crumbling, and Nero felt it. He expected freedom after her death. What he found was dread. Days after the murder, Nero grew erratic. He refused meals. He locked himself in chambers, pacing for hours, sometimes weeping, sometimes ranting. He reportedly told his advisors, "I have killed the one who gave me birth." The reality of matricide, once an abstract idea whispered by power-hungry men, was now an unchangeable fact. And it haunted him. Behind palace walls, he was unraveling. But in public, he tried to maintain composure. He appeared at games, delivered speeches, and hosted banquets, all under the watchful eyes of a court that had seen the dagger behind the curtain. The performances felt hollow. Even his infamous charm, once enough to sway crowds and senators alike, began to lose its luster. And then there were the dreams. Servants claimed Nero would wake screaming in the night. He saw Agrippina, rising from her shallow grave, eyes wide with vengeance, blood dripping from the wound she herself had commanded. "Strike my womb!" Her words echoed in his ears, turning sleep into torture. To silence the ghost, he ordered a series of purification rituals. Animals were sacrificed, temples cleansed, soothsayers brought in to chant and burn incense, but nothing worked. The guilt was not in the walls. It was in his mind. Rome noticed the change. Nero grew paranoid. He stopped trusting his advisors. He changed guards weekly. He began to travel with a small army of spies, always watching, always listening for signs of dissent. The man who had once performed music for the masses now feared the sound of his own footsteps in the hall, and the people, they started talking again, quietly at first, then more boldly. The word matricide became a dark joke at taverns. Children whispered ghost stories about the empress who haunted the palace. Statues of Nero were found defaced, eyes scratched out, mouths smeared with red pigment. The empire was restless. Agrippina had died without ceremony, without praise, without pity, but she had not died in silence. Her ghost lingered, not just in Nero's dreams, but in the soul of the city. But it wasn't just politics closing. It was something darker. In the quiet of night, the Empress returned, not in body, but in screams. Agrippina was dead, her ashes scattered, her villa reduced to rubble, her name purged from public records, statues toppled and coins melted. But no matter how many symbols Nero destroyed, one thing refused to vanish: her presence. At first, it was a whisper in the dark. Nero began to wake at night, drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced someone was watching him. He would sit up in bed and stare at the corners of the room, certain he saw shadows moving just beyond the light. When he called out, no one came, not because they didn't hear him, but because his cries had become a regular occurrence. The palace had grown used to its emperor's nightmares. Then came the visions, in mirrors, in torchlight, in the reflections. Of polished marble, Agrippina appeared. Not always fully, sometimes just her eyes, dark and knowing. Sometimes her silhouette, regal and still. Other times, she appeared exactly as she had died, blooded, eyes wide, her hand gripping the place where the blade struck her womb. Nero tried everything. He summoned priests to perform purification rituals, burnt offerings, and called magicians from the far corners of the empire. He sacrificed rare animals, recited ancient chants, even walked barefoot through temples. But nothing worked. The more he tried to drive her away, the closer she came. His madness grew worse in private. He began talking to her, aloud. Servants would overhear him pacing and whispering, pleading with her. "Why did you make me do it?" he'd ask. "Why won't you leave?" No answer came, only silence that pressed on him like a curse. He banned the mention of her name at court. Anyone who even referenced her, even indirectly, was punished. One noble, in an act of subtle defiance, compared a minor official's ambition to a mother's reach. He was exiled within the week. Another, who praised a statue that resembled Agrippina, was found drowned. The guilt consumed Nero from the inside. He stopped sleeping altogether, walking the halls at night, clutching his lyre, humming sad, broken tunes. His music, once filled with energy and flair, turned into dirges, eerie, somber melodies that echoed through the palace like funeral hymns. He would play for hours, sometimes until his fingers bled, chasing a sound he could never quite capture. A sound that might quiet the voice in his head. Poppaea, who had once encouraged the rift between Nero and Agrippina, tried to comfort him. But even she grew wary. The man she had once seduced into killing his own mother was no longer just ambitious. He was unraveling. He stared through her, forgetting her name mid-conversation, snapping with violent fury at the slightest suggestion. One night, Nero attempted a public ritual in front of Rome's elite to rid himself of her spirit. Priests chanted. Smoke filled the temple. Nero screamed her name, demanding she be gone. But the onlookers, far from reassured, were horrified. Their emperor had become a haunted man, not by enemies, but by a woman already dead. And the people remembered. They remembered that Agrippina had been ambitious, yes, but she had also been brilliant. She had protected Rome's stability, ensured its succession, guided its empire through turbulent waters, and her reward was betrayal, murder, disgrace. To many, it no longer seemed like justice. It looked like guilt. Nero began to believe she cursed him. Every failure, every rebellion, every assassination attempt, he blamed her. She was the storm behind his empire's decline, and if he could not kill her spirit, he would burn the world she once ruled. The palace became a prison. Nero trusted no one. He started disguising himself to walk among citizens at night, hoping to gauge their feelings, fearful they might turn against him as they had turned against others. And always, even in disguise, he feared he'd hear her voice, calling his name, whispering reminders, asking him if the throne had been worth the cost. Madness breeds fear, and fear, when wielded by an emperor, becomes a sword drawn against everyone, even Rome itself. After Agrippina's death, Nero was emperor in name and reality. The strings that had once bound him were severed. He had finally silenced the voice that once whispered commands in his ear, the voice of the mother who had created him. But freedom for Nero did not bring peace. It brought paranoia. And paranoia in the hands of a Roman emperor meant death for everyone else. Without Agrippina's political restraint, Nero plunged into his darkest instincts. He surrounded himself with flatterers and sycophants, men who told him he was divine, who praised his music as sacred, who dared not speak the truth. The imperial court became a theater of delusion, where fear was currency and flattery the only protection. Nero began purging the Senate, accusing prominent Romans of treason with little to no evidence. Executions became routine, often public, often brutal. Some were stabbed, others forced to open their veins in ritual suicide. Families were destroyed, fortunes seized, names erased. The message was clear: loyalty wasn't enough, silence wasn't enough, survival depended on worship. But Nero's violence didn't come from strength, it came from fear. Deep down, he was still that insecure boy, terrified of being abandoned, outshined, or forgotten. Agrippina's murder had not rid him of her shadow. If anything, it had grown longer. Every defiant senator reminded him of her sharp tongue. Every ambitious noblewoman echoed her cunning. He saw her in dreams, in reflections, in the faces of the people who no longer clapped when he sang. And then came the fire. In July of 64 AD, a blaze ignited in the Circus Maximus. Fanned by summer winds and Rome's densely packed wooden tenements, the fire spread with terrifying speed. It raged for 9 days, consuming temples, shops, homes, libraries. Nearly 2/3 of the city was reduced to ash. Where was Nero? Some claimed he was miles away in Antium, rushing back when news reached him. Others insisted he stood atop a tower, watching the inferno with delight, plucking his lyre and singing of Troy as flames danced across the skyline. The truth may never be known, but the perception was fatal. Rome believed he had let it burn, or worse, caused it. To deflect the growing rage, Nero needed a scapegoat. He found it in the Christians, a strange fringe sect already distrusted by the public. He accused them of starting the fire and unleashed a wave of persecution unmatched. In cruelty, men and women were arrested by the thousands. Some were sewn into animal skins and thrown to wild dogs. Others were crucified. Many were coated in pitch and set ablaze to light Nero's gardens at night. The people were horrified, but they also understood this was not justice. This was terror. The emperor had turned Rome into a crucible of blood, purging not only enemies, but anyone who reminded him of his guilt. Even Poppaea Sabina, his beloved empress, the woman for whom he had defied his mother, could not escape his rage. Pregnant with his child, she reportedly provoked his anger during a private quarrel. Nero, consumed by fury, struck her in the abdomen. She died shortly after, along with their unborn child. It was as if every bond he formed was fated to end in violence. Nero now stood completely alone, surrounded by statues, mirrors, and ghosts. The public turned cold. The aristocracy grew restless. The legions grumbled. Revolts erupted across the empire. In the east, generals began declaring their own authority. In the west, governors ignored imperial orders. The world was slipping through Nero's fingers, and even his most devoted guards began questioning his sanity. But Nero wasn't fighting rebels or traitors. He was still fighting her. Every murder, every spectacle, every fire was an attempt to bury the memory of Agrippina, the mother who raised him, ruled him, and haunted him. And when the empire turned against its golden boy, Nero ran from death, only to find Agrippina waiting at the end of his story. Nero's empire was crumbling, and for the first time in his life, no one was coming to save him. The Senate had declared him a public enemy. His allies had either been executed or turned against him. His once loyal generals were leading revolts. In the provinces, The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor, abandoned him. The people of Rome, who once roared with joy at the sight of their golden boy, now shouted for his death. He had become what he feared most, powerless, unloved, and utterly alone. In the shadows of his final days, Nero wandered through the empty corridors of his palace, muttering to himself, scratching poetry into the walls, clinging to fading fantasies of performance and greatness. He believed somehow that he could still return to the stage, that if Rome heard him sing one more time, it would forgive him. But the applause was long gone, and the only sound left was the echo of his own madness. He fled the capital in disguise, wearing tattered robes and hiding beneath a hood. With a handful of terrified servants, he escaped to the countryside, seeking refuge in a dilapidated villa on the outskirts of Rome. There, in filth and fear, the emperor who once dined with kings and drowned cities in fire now dug his own grave. With trembling hands, the Senate ordered his arrest and execution. Soldiers were closing in. He begged his few remaining attendants to kill him, but they refused. Even in death, no one wanted his blood on their hands. Finally, as footsteps approached, he pressed a blade to his own throat and drove it in with the help of a servant. His final words were soft, barely heard. Some claim he whispered, "Qualis artifex pereo," "What an artist dies in me." Others say it was something simpler, more human, more tragic, a plea for his mother's forgiveness. No one knows for certain. The emperor who once ruled the known world died like a criminal in hiding, his body abandoned and unclaimed. Rome did not mourn. His name was stripped from monuments, his portraits defaced, his memory condemned by decree. Historians would debate his life for centuries, artist or tyrant, genius or madman, but beneath the myth, one truth remained constant. Agrippina outlived him, not in body. Her ashes had long since cooled, but in legacy. Every account of Nero's rise and fall, every scandal, every blood-soaked decision led back to her. The woman who birthed him, who placed a crown upon his head, who dared to rule through him, became the ghost he could never exorcise. She shaped his destiny and haunted his ruin. Even in his worst moments, it was her presence, her judgment, her expectations, her relentless ambition that drove him to the edge. Agrippina, in her terrifying brilliance, had created an emperor, and in doing so she had given Rome a tragedy too vast for the stage. Historians remember her as ruthless, cunning, manipulative, but they also remember her as one of the most powerful women Rome ever knew. She wielded influence in a world that offered women none. She survived emperors, conspiracies, and exile. She didn't just navigate the empire, she bent it until it finally snapped. Nero tried to erase her. He failed, because every time we speak of his madness, we invoke her name. Every time we recall his crimes, we see the shadow she cast. His greatest act, his greatest horror, was not in burning Rome, but in killing the woman who made him. In the end, the woman he tried to silence became his legacy. Agrippina the Younger, the mother who made an emperor and unmade a god.